fire and ecological revitalization. Oops, for some reason that just popped me out. All right. So that first image, that first slide there, in the background, you can see cattails mainly burning, and cattail and tule is a traditional food source, as well as having many other native cultural uses. And these plants are not fire dependent. Obviously, they're wetland plants, and one might not typically associate fire with this plant community, but in fact, native peoples have been burning in wetland plant communities for thousands of years, and there are many, many positive outcomes, as I mentioned, for food gathering, but also for improving habitat productivity, but also diversity, which translates to increased biodiversity. And that's one of the themes of this presentation that I'll be going back to repeatedly, is the connection between biodiversity and cultural fecundity, or reaching full cultural potential. And so culture, native indigenous culture in California is deeply tied to ecology. And of course, native people have been working with fire for thousands of years, and this process has a lot to contribute to prescribed fire and restoration. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So just a little introduction about myself. I'm a restoration ecologist. My passion is for California native plants. Along the way, I also developed a deep passion for ethnobotany, and not just having this removed botanical perspective, but actually developing a relationship with the plants and understanding the meaning that these plants have for people, and how they are related to other organisms within the environment. Obviously, that's a big part of ecology, but especially that human-plant relationship is of a lot of interest to me. So I'm working to get my state certified prescribed fire burn boss certification, hopefully at the end of this month. I'll be finished. I've been working towards that goal for a number of years now, and I've worked quite a bit in cultural fire and prescribed fire, and I really feel that the way forward in so many realms, especially within the wildfire crisis we're experiencing in California, but also, as I mentioned, in other areas too, we really need to be focusing on this synthesis of traditional ecological knowledge and modern restoration ecology, and other disciplines of modern science, because these two fields, instead of being seen as disparate, we need to be seeing them as complementary. And like to think of it as, why hobble along on one leg when you can be walking on two legs and, running much faster, reaching your destination, reaching your goals much faster. So I think we can reach our goals in terms of fuels management and ecological restoration much more efficiently if we can actually walk on two legs of Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. So next, I'm just kind of going to be going into what is ecocultural revitalization. And so the first thing I'd like to discuss is the difference between restoration and revitalization. And the reason I've chosen to use the term revitalization is because as I mentioned, in the native Californian perspective, ecology and culture are intimately linked. And so when you are restoring native plants, native animals, you're also working towards creating a foundation for revitalizing culture. And so culture in many ways is actually living. It's dependent on the living organism, and it's also ever changing, which is an important thing to note. You know, as we incorporate drip torches into cultural fire, many modern native cultural practitioners use, electric grinders for processing their acorn meal. So ecocultural revitalization is the simultaneous act of restoring native plants and animals, but also restoring culture. And should, both of these things should be seen as having life, and as having that life be interdependent on the other. And so this background picture is just some broadcast burning, and then that's a propane torch there, just one of those, flame weeders, which can be really helpful for getting a burn pile going if it's a little reluctant, or if you're trying to speed things up. So I just wanted to, really talk here about the fact that the Nisenan, Maidu, and Miwok people, their cultures is very much still here, but like native deer grass, like many other native plants, it cannot flourish without fire. So fire, as I mentioned, is at the heart of ecocultural revitalization. So every aspect of material native culture was derived from native plant, animal, or mineral. And so this human interdependence on ecological integrity was, deeply understood, and biodiversity was a high value, as well as the ecosystem integrity, and what we would call today as ecosystem services were never taken for granted. In fact, they were actively managed, and this is a big distinction, to be made from the false notion of the native Californian as a hunter-gatherer. In fact, this was, very high-level agriculture, high-scale management, high-scale agroforestry that we were seeing across the state, and this was absolutely a necessity in order to support the material culture, but also the spiritual goals and other goals of the people. So as I mentioned, ecology is culture, and culture is ecology. And California represented one of the most culturally diverse areas in North America, if not the most culturally diverse, pre-settlement, pre-contact. And there were over 500 dialects spoken in California. And so hundreds of thousands of native people were living here. And as I mentioned, that required a tremendous amount of plant material, and animals, and minerals. And this was a large scale trade system, and a large scale management system that was also extremely sustainable. And part of me likes to think that sometimes we have a hard time recognizing this relationship as agriculture, because it's just so much more sustainable than the typical way that we practice agriculture today. But it's hard to even use the same terms like agroforestry and agriculture and these kinds of things. But it's it's that same scale of land management. It's just a different approach. So a little bit more to that scale of land management. This is a quote which from a book I'm sure most of you are familiar with, Kat Anderson's Tending the Wild. And it says the approximate 25 weavers, basket weavers in a prehistoric village of 100 persons might harvest on the order of 250,000 shoots in a single season to support their basketry making needs. This would be for, around a dozen baskets or so. And so, if you multiply this by the actual population size, plus factor in the tending and gathering of plants and animals for food and medicine, regalia, clothing, tools, etc., it's easy to see that cultural fire is not always small scale, and that's something that a lot of people tend to associate with cultural fire, and certainly it's one should associate low intensity with cultural fire, but small scale is not always the case. Today, it's often the case due to the reduced land base and the fuels problem that's accumulated, and you can only take small chunks out. So the situation has changed, but there was certainly watershed scale burning that was going on pre-contact, and it was because native peoples had stayed on top of the fuel for so long that you were able to do larger scale burns, but they also had a deep understanding of TEK and of the topography, of the weather, of the different plant communities and how these factors would influence fire behavior. And so I like to mention the work of Don Hankins for anyone who's not familiar with his work up at CSU Chico. And he's an amazing native professor that actually burns based off of the topography and moisture gradients from shaded fuel breaks and other aspects of the landscape that he can read, rather than installing very cut and dry fuel breaks. And certainly it's a far cry from some of the huge and somewhat destructive fire breaks we can see sometimes to implement prescribed fire. And I'm not saying that everyone should go out and do that, but I am saying that it's a testament to the deep body of knowledge that Native people have when it comes to using this management tool. And so the pictures that you see on this slide, that man in his hand is holding a native bulb, one of many species of what are known as Indian potatoes. And these bulbs were tended with fire and dug up and replanted. And it was a tremendous food source, in addition to acorns and oak trees, of course, were also tended with fire in specific times of year to target the acorn weevils and filbert moths. And so it was, as I said, similar to our current agricultural system and the way that we target specific pests at very specific times with specific tools. And below you see a Maidu gambling tray woven by Lucy Pony. And so a little bit more about what is cultural fire. So let me just take a sip of water real quick. And I'll try and leave some time at the end for questions here. I would love to hear from the group, but also feel free to chime in with questions in the chat if anything comes to mind. So I was saying cultural fire is the ancient land stewardship and ecological management practice of the intentional application of fire to specific species and communities. And as I mentioned, it was a highly complex system pre-contact, and there are various reasons that we now have a very different situation today, and are having massive wildfires, and of course, much of that due to fire suppression, but also due to the lack of cultural fire and prescribed fire, which I'm sure everybody here knows. So this is kind of like a compare and contrast a little bit. And there's so many more things you could go into, but just a little bit of the differences of cultural fire versus prescribed fire. And in cultural fire, you don't see the same kind of sort of paramilitary structure that you see in prescribed fire. And there's, pros and cons of many of these things. But I think there's things in prescribed fire that we need to see more of, that you see in cultural fire, like the strong cultural and ecological objectives, which sometimes are non-existent in prescribed fire or not maximized to their fullest potential. You don't often see as much of a focus on heterogeneity that you see in cultural fire, and you can sometimes see this acres burned metric where they're just trying to get as many acres of black as possible, and that was never the mentality with cultural burning. It was much more sensitive, and there were some areas that were purposely more intense fire was applied, and purposely there was less intense fire. And so it was typically what I see in cultural fire is there's a lot more heterogeneity, and this contributes to biodiversity. This is so the opposite, of course, of what we see with wildfires, where we have these stand replacing wildfires that come through and sometimes will completely reset the plant communities and drastically reduce the number of species that you find in these areas. Another thing that we often don't see in prescribed fire is a lot of knowledge transfer, where people are reducing obstacles to certifications and things of that nature. And as I mentioned, there's reasons for certain things, and I think there's pros and cons. But I personally feel that we have a lot to learn from the community involvement that you see in traditional fire, where people were burning together as families, as villages, as communities, and that's the essence of PBAs, and that's one of the most wonderful things about the PBA movement is that we're seeing this return to community-driven management, and that's absolutely the direction we need to be going, rather than having a few people on a pedestal that can only use a drip torch. And then it would also be wonderful to incorporate some of these deeper tending relationships into prescribed fire. And there's so much room for collaboration between tribal and non-tribal entities doing burns and finding ways to maximize the cultural value in burns, even when it's not necessarily a tribe that's burning. And this slide here is just kind of an example of what one of those smaller scale burns can look like, and the attention to detail that's taken, where you can see in this picture on the left, eventually that whole area was burned, but you're having really intense fire concentrated right on this redbud stump that was coppiced, and then around the broadcast burn was much lighter intensity. And so we really could see a lot of heterogeneity in this burn afterwards, and I'll show some pictures later of some of these post cultural burn photos. And on the right, you can see Miwok elder Ardith Reed is actually gathering basketry shoots from the redbud that was burned 1 year prior. And so this is just one example of the use of cultural fire and how fire is essential in this case to creating the basketry material that's at the heart of the traditions of both Miwok, Maidu, every tribe in California practiced weaving. And so it was something that's ubiquitous, which is not often the case in California tribes. You see a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of cultural practices from one tribe to another, but the art of practice of weaving was widespread and highly technical. For those of you who don't know, that some baskets were woven so masterfully, they were watertight, good cooking baskets. So you could get hot rocks in there and cook in the basket without any water seeping out. And Ardith is a master basket weaver. And so she's carefully selecting the right redbud shoots. And I'll talk a little bit later about a more detail on why this is so essential. But in this case, we're burning for basketry material, but there's also a lot of fuel reduction that's going on. It's reducing periodically burning reduces the pest populations. In this case, there's also a weevil that feeds on the redbud seeds. So there's a lot of benefits beyond the main cultural objective here. And so why burn? This quote I love, it's from Klamath River Jack, and he was warning the Department of Fish and Game all the way back in 1916 about the importance of cultural fire and the effects of fire exclusion. And so this quote here says how he talks about fire as a tool for sophisticated pest management and a technique to benefit deer and elk. And I'm just trying to move my screen here so I can actually read the quote. So I'll just quickly read it here. Indians have, he wrote this letter, by the way, to Fish and Game, and it's titled An Indian's View of Burning and a Reply. So Indians have no medicine to put on all the places where bugs and worms are, so he burns. Every year, Indians burn. Fire burns up old acorns that fall on the ground. Old acorns on the ground have lots of worms. Not burning old acorns, not burning old bark, old leaves, bugs, and worms. More come every year. Fire makes new sprouts for deer and elk to eat and kills lots of brush, so there's always plenty of open grassland for grass. No fire and the brush grows quicker, and after a while chokes out all the grass and makes too much shade. Then the grass gets sour, it's no good for eating. No fire, then too much leaf stays on the ground. No grass can grow up, too much dead leaf, grass gets sour. Indian burns every year just the same, so keep all the ground clean. No bark, no dead leaf, no old wood on ground, no old wood on brush, so no bug can stay to eat the leaf, and no worm can stay to eat the berry and acorn. Not much on ground to make a hot fire, so it never hurts the big trees where the fire burns. Now white man never burns. He passed a law to stop all the fire in the forest and wild pasture. And look where we are today. We're having these mega fires. And I think this quote is so powerful because it was very prescient warning about the importance of cultural fire. And I also love how it refers to fire as medicine. And it's just very, very powerful metaphor that also ties in with prescribed fire, right? It's a prescription, much like a medical prescription. And that's, I think, a very good way to think about good fire, and the fact that good fire is dependent on the prescription and the amount, and too much or too little can be very bad, and that depends on the situation, of course. So why burn? As I mentioned, you're increasing the quality and abundance of culturally significant plant materials. You're reducing pest and disease populations, and you're maintaining heterogeneity and species diversity. And so again, what I mean by heterogeneity is you're having burned and unburned grasses and burned and unburned shrubs, and you're still doing a tremendous amount of fuel reduction, but you're not necessarily trying to have this 100% fuel reduction standard and create these huge fuel breaks. It's a much more diverse way of managing habitat, and creates more productive habitat, and of course by providing more niches for different species. And so foreground there, you can see of the top picture is a deer grass with flower stalks that have been have come up after the previous year in which it was burned, and they're extremely plentiful compared to what it looked like before. And so all those deer grass behind it were burned that very year, and so they're just starting to resprout, and that's what the lower picture is, and that's probably about 2 weeks after the burn. So they start to come back here quickly. And more reasons why to burn, and this is of course from the cultural fire perspective: cycling of nutrients, reducing fuels, increasing accessibility for gathering, managing game populations through strategic forage enhancement. And so that top picture you see there is a patch of tule that's growing along the edge of a wetland, and that was burned just probably 4 months prior to that photo. And the tule was really thick. It was actually pretty incredible, the flame lengths that came off of it, probably like 20 foot flame lengths in some areas. And this was like a winter burn as well. So tule and cattail surprisingly can burn hotter than a lot of other fuels, even though you might not associate that with wetland field types, but I digress. So the importance here with the tule that I was going to mention is that it was totally impenetrable before. It was like this overgrown thatch of tule, and you could never even get in there to get at the new shoots, which the new tule shoots are a very common food source for tribes in this area. And so this not only stimulates a lot of new tule shoots to grow, but it also makes it so that you can go in there and gather tule shoots much more easily, which is also the case for burning around oak trees. And often tribes managed to have heritage oak populations. So, typically forest density was much thinner because you could have fewer oaks that would produce a great abundance of acorns. And then you would have open gathering areas without all these small trees coming up and competing. And so the trees were much healthier, of course, as well, when drought came and there was less competition for water, as well as other resources like sunlight. And managing game populations through forage enhancement, that's pretty self-explanatory. Managing the forest, the amount of sunlight that's reaching the floor in terms of the canopy, how open it is, and managing the understory composition through fire. All of these things can strategically create more forage and bring deer populations closer to where your preferred hunting grounds are. That bottom picture is an example of a cultural burn, and you can see, at this point, most people are just kind of standing back and watching because we're done with the firing operations and all the clearing and that sort of thing, or those sorts of things. So what I really love about this picture, though, is there's UC Davis students present, there's tribal members present, there's some local firefighters and other people from air quality agency that came out. So to me, this is that community involvement aspect of prescribed fire, and cultural fire, which I absolutely love to see. when there's this kind of collaboration. And I think that's absolutely the spirit of cultural fire. And we even had younger kids out. Of course, they weren't participating directly, but they were able to kind of observe and participate a little bit. And I think that's so important to be, getting the younger generation in so that they can become future stewards. And that's something that was inherent in cultural fires, that you had, really young kids out there learning from their parents and their grandparents, and it was something you just grew up doing. And it would be amazing if, today we could grow up having more of a relationship with fire rather than being disconnected or being fearful, which is often the case just because people don't have these kinds of opportunities to engage. So here's an example of a redbud resprouting after fire. You can see the picture on the left. Redbud has not been burned. The picture on the right, it's in the process of being tended by Diana Almendiras. And then the picture on the far right is the redbud regrowth after the burn. And so it's pretty clear to see how productive the fire was in promoting good basketry material, the picture on the right. So a little bit more on why specifically to burn redbud. So redbud has a number of characteristics that are modified through cultural fire, including shoot length, flexibility, internode length, uniformity of diameter, absence of axillary buds, and color. So this slide is just talking a little bit about why to burn black oak. And it's taken from a wonderful paper written by Ron Good, Frank Lake, and Jonathan Long. And you can see here that the diagram is showing some of the effects: reduced dead surface fuels, promoting the survival of larger old oak trees that produce the most acorns and form large cavities for wildlife. So it goes back to what I just mentioned about specifically managing for heritage trees and promoting less forest density, promoting broad crowns and open stands with grassy understories by inhibiting overtopping by conifers, maintaining low branches by keeping flame lengths low, rejuvenating young oak sprouts and other plants consumed by deer, reducing the incidence of filbert weevils and filbert worms that infest acorns, which I also mentioned before, making the gathering more efficient, stimulating production of edible mushrooms, increasing moisture availability to adjacent meadows. And these are all things that cultural fire practitioners will talk about when you speak to them about fire. And I'll share quickly one of my experiences burning up with the Karuk tribe when I was on the Klamath treks. And I learned that they burn to send smoke up in the air to call the salmon. Their people largely depend on salmon. That's a huge staple for the Karuk tribe, as well as the Yurok and the Kupa. And so they actually call the salmon up with smoke. And there's more to it than just the spiritual act of, the ceremonial fire. They actually send smoke up in the air to reduce solar radiation, direct radiation hitting the water, and thereby cool water temperatures, which in recent years, this has actually been crucial for salmon populations that have been almost extirpated due to low water flows during drought years and extremely high water temperatures. So I was also talking to an elder that talked about how important fire was for balancing the pH of waterways. And so cultural fire practitioners have, as I mentioned, this deep knowledge of TEK and the amount of factors they can be thinking about, the complexity is often much deeper than what you see on a prescribed fire, where it doesn't go much deeper than what's in the prescription or what's in the burn plan, which is not to say that, you know, a burn plan is not a robust document, but I think I just invite all fire practitioners to think about some of these deeper interactions when thinking about burning, and how these kinds of things can be maximized, even on, like I said, non-tribally led burns. So wrapping up here, do you want to be cognizant of time? And I want to leave a little bit for questions at the end. These last couple slides here are talking about synergizing fire and restoration. So as I mentioned, cultural fire is at the heart of ecocultural revitalization. And I really feel ecological restoration needs to strive to learn more from cultural fire practitioners, deep understanding, especially of the phenological and ecological factors that influence the outcomes of burning. So this picture on the right here, you see a native grassland that was once infested with invasive annuals, but now has almost 100% native plant cover. And you can see the little yarrow plugs that are growing in. They're quite happy. Those were planted shortly after the burn into the areas that had been primed through the reduction in invasive annuals through the application of fire. So this, to me, is an amazing example of how fire should be used in restoration planning. And, you know, rather than going through and using selective herbicide to try and rid a native grassland of broadleaf annuals, a strategic timing of fire can have the same effect, and it also can promote the growth of native plants that are introduced shortly after the burn window. This picture I love. It's from cultural burn. It shows we basically let the fire go out right to the left of center there. And so you can see on the left is an area of total fire exclusion. And this was really just due to moisture gradients. There was a water source on the left-hand side. And so the fire was creeping along, very low intensity backing fire, and it just didn't make it past this point. And so being that it was a cultural burn, we didn't go through there with, you know, diesel fuel and drip torches and try and get it to light off. We just accepted that, and it allowed for this wonderful compare and contrast here of one side, which was broadcast burned with the proper phenological timing to target the invasive annual grasses that you see on the left-hand side. And the left-hand side shows what that fire exclusion looks like. And it looks very green right now, but I will tell you, come summer, you know, I'd be much more concerned on the left side about the fuel receptivity there, and the right side, you know, in many areas, obviously those purple needlegrass in the picture are still growing in, so there's going to be more connectivity. Won't see as much bare ground a few months from them in the summer, but still it's going to be much better for wildfire preparedness. This picture shows some of the, like I said, attention to detail that can go into a cultural burn. The left-hand pictures is before, right-hand pictures after, and we wanted to have a little bit more fire intensity in this patch of native grassland, which was having a little bit of resurgence of some annual invasive broadleaf annuals. And so we were noticing we were getting a lot of patchy fire on the other part of the grassland, which was, we didn't mind at all. It was creating some nice diversity. But as we got to the patch that had some some weed suppression that we wanted to accomplish. We actually took dried tule, from an area where we're doing a small little fuel break just around a bridge feature we wanted to protect for on a future burn, and we just added it to this area to increase the fire intensity, and it ended up being exactly what we needed. And come the next season, it was drastic reduction in a lot of the thistles and erodium and cut-leaf geranium and other stuff that we were seeing there. So that was labor intensive, but as I mentioned, it's a great example of how targeted you can be on a cultural burn. And I wanted to end by just talking a little bit about United Auburn Indian Community's vision for ecocultural revitalization in a little bit more of a concrete fashion, and explain what that has looked like and what that is going to look like in the future. So the image on the left, you can see Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for Auburn, Matt Moore. He's had quite a long service in the long career in the fire service, and so he kind of wears multiple hats in that way. And he's working with me to establish the cultural fire and prescribed fire program with the tribe. And so in this site here, we're working to clear vegetation from a cultural site. There was numerous bedrock mortars, house pits. It was a village site. And so this area, as is typical Forest Service policy, had been flagged and avoided for the last 3 decades. So it had a huge accumulation of fuel. And this is standard policy within Forest Service. When they find cultural sites, they will flag and avoid 50 or so foot buffer around the site. And so anytime there's active thinning or fuels management, these sites are completely avoided. And you have, as I mentioned, the inherent accumulation of fuels directly on these cultural sites. And this has been so bad in terms of the fire intensity it's created in some of the past wildfires, like the Caldor and King. We have seen spalding of granite. So granite actually breaking off, and rocks actually splitting apart from the intense amount of heat from the wildfires. And of course, it just devastates these cultural sites, and it looks like, you know, a nuclear war zone afterwards, instead of a very significant cultural place. So this is something that we're going to be doing within the cultural fire program, is doing manual thinning and tending to the site, allowing it to breathe, as Matt says, and then we will be bringing cultural fire in to maintain the site. And this also ties in with the archaeological work that we're doing to further identify cultural resources on the site. And as we remove that duff layer, you know, with cultural fire, some of the ground penetrating radar and magnetometry, other instrumentation that we're using to collect data at these sites, it's actually greatly improved, and we're seeing more. So we are protecting the sites, we're tending to the sites, restoring the sites, and also it's allowing us to get more data through cultural fire. So there's a lot of synergies here. And one of the final thoughts that I'll end on is that, you know, we're really focusing on these cultural sites because as the title of this slide mentions here, they are the touchstones to the ancestors. And Matt Moore, who I just mentioned, you know, these cultural sites looked a very different way. And he explains that in order for these sites to be whole, they need to be restored and they need to be revitalized. And so typically these sites would have never seen fire exclusion, and we would have seen a tremendous amount of native understory diversity and forbs that we're not seeing today. And that's part of the soul of these sites that is dormant and is waiting to be expressed with fire. And so this is UAIC's starting point, is really stewarding these places of cultural significance, but ultimately the entire area, Placer County and beyond, that was the tribe's historic homeland, is very highly valued in terms of stewardship priorities. So there's a lot of work that we plan to do in terms of expanding the amount of cultural and prescribed fire that we can do for the community once we're able to tend to these sites to the best of our ability. And so you can see there's native gum plant plugs on the left-hand side there, just an example of some of the restoration propagation work we're doing and going to be continuing to do to bring these sites back to the way they should be, as I said, make them whole again and allow them to awake from that state of dormancy. And so fire, of course, is going to be key in that. And that last image on the right-hand side, I think, is sort of symbolic of that process of revitalization. And you can see it's deer grass resprouting, the very tip of those grass blades. You can see the burnt tip from the previous cultural burn. And then there's sort of this white gradient that goes to green. And so the white is, of course, the fire heat stress tissue that's recovering, and slowly you get down to the meristem and the green that's coming out, which is, the revitalization after the fire, after the death. So it's, I personally love that picture because it's just, I think it's so cool how you can see burned to new life all on one blade of grass there. So with that, I'm happy to take questions from everyone, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zach. I'm not sure if Cordy is able to participate, but that was a fantastic presentation. And the fact that you have that direct experience with tribal elders and scientists all together, that makes it certainly even more special. I saw there's 2 messages in the chat, so I can read those to you if you haven't seen them yourself yet. One is from Amber, who's asking if you're propagating your own native plugs, or do you utilize a contract with nurseries in the area or something similar like that?
Yeah, so right now it's mostly contracting out, but it's something that I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to do more of in the future, is actually in-house propagation at one of the, excuse me, one of the sites that the tribe owns. We think would be a really good candidate for that. And there's a lot of interest behind that. It's just a matter of sort of getting everyone on the same page and getting the resources together to do that. But we definitely feel that we have an internal need for locally sourced native plant stock within Placer County. And as we talk to other people, there's also a need that we're hearing. So of course, we would hope that we can address that, but we'll see how that goes, because our big focus right now is definitely on the cultural and prescribed fire program, and certainly the propagation would tie in so nicely with that. So we'll see how that goes, and yeah, I'm hopeful there, but nothing too concrete as of yet.
If it's okay, I'll just chime in and add that the Amat Mutsun Tribal Land Trust has a program like that at Pie Ranch. And so you may be able to lean on some of what they've already done in that whole process. They do have a couple folks that they consult with as well, which you may already know, Rick Flores, who's an ethnobotanist, and also they have their own propagation manager, of course, but they're a good resource.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah, definitely. I do know Val Lopez over with Amamutsun, and it's amazing the work that they're doing over there. And we would definitely, I think, love to tie in with them. So that's, I will keep that in mind. I think that would be fun to set up a meeting with them one of these days.
Field trip.
It's a long field trip, but I wouldn't mind.
Sign me up. Another question here is, what do you think is the best time to burn invasive grasses such as foxtails, etc.?
Yeah, so that's really dependent on the year and how much precipitation we've gotten. So obviously, the amount of precipitation really influences the phenology and with the timing of growth that we see with annual grasses. So it really does vary. I've had in drier years a lot of success burning as early as February. The nice thing is that if it's a drier year, you can get more fire severity earlier in the year when these grasses and invasive annuals are relatively young in terms of germination and so forth. So it's sort of a balance, but you're trying to balance fire intensity with the maturity of the plant itself. And so generally, the younger the grass, the more likely the higher the mortality will be. So I can't give a direct answer for that one, but the nice thing is that if you have native grasses, you can generally burn, any time before they actually start to actively produce an inflorescence, and they'll, be quite happy with that fire, and you'll see them greening up within a couple weeks. And that's some of the most satisfying burning I've ever done, is burning in native grasslands that have invasive annuals and so forth. And you see the native grasses come back within 2 weeks, and it's just this, beautiful, vibrant green with no weeds. It never lasts like that forever. That's why you have to keep fire coming back into these systems, which can be neglected sometimes. And that's definitely a downfall with sometimes when I see fire and restoration, it's like, oh, we burned once, we did it. It's like, you're not doing consistent fire applications, weeds will usually find a way back.
Great, thank you. I see 2 more questions. I know it's 7 o'clock, but for those of you who want to stay and listen to Zach's responses, one is, have you read by any chance Smokescreen by Chad Hansen? And if so, what's your opinion of what's presented in that book? You probably don't want to elaborate too much on that, but if you have read it, maybe you can give us a quick response to that question. This question is from Robin Mitchell.
I have not read that book, but I will certainly check it out.
All right, and then there is one question from Johnny Appleking. How much conversation? I think Johnny only joined us halfway the conversation, halfway your presentation. He's asking how much conversation was had about mandating cultural site monitors deployed on agency burns, like they are for burn scar cleanup and construction projects.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really great point, Johnny. I don't think there's been enough conversation about that. We're sort of, I think we're going to be having similar parallel conversations with agencies in the near future, and that's something that we've kind of been thinking about bringing up. But there's of course a lot of other priorities we're trying to balance right now. But it's certainly it's a really good point you raise, because it's the potential for disturbance of cultural sites and cultural resources is often just as high on some of these agency burns, and I think it's just a relationship that we're trying to build right now, and I think, you know, up in the Karuk tribe, they've been able to build really good relationships with their agencies, and I think they get tied in more with agency burns, but you know, we're trying to build that relationship with CAL FIRE and with other agencies, and it's, you know, it's a process. But just recently I heard, I don't really know the details, but I heard CAL FIRE lost one recently in our area, so that's a different conversation. But yeah, thanks for that question, Johnny. We're definitely thinking about that.
Great. Someone says, go Aggies. Here's a last question and an invitation from Amber. If you have any written materials regarding the ecological benefits of burning, could you share those with this group, maybe afterwards sending it to Cordy, and she can send out a message to everyone?
Oh, definitely. I have plenty of articles to share, so I'll try not to spam you guys, but I'll send some stuff over.
Fantastic. Cordy, are you by any chance back with us? That sounds like a no, so I will, as your substitute host, thank you so much for that presentation, Zach, and thank you everyone for attending it. And I'm sure Cordy will send out the recording as well as any materials that Zach can provide to all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.